Hello and welcome to our third seminar of the Decolonizing the Curriculum series. I think Daniel's just practicing screen sharing right now. It's been a bit techy. It's our first time sort of doing a conference online, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So we've got Daniel Stone this afternoon to share with us some thoughts and to stimulate some discussion. But before we get into all of that, I've got some boring housekeeping things to talk about. So yeah, welcome to the conference. Thank you for those who've come on time or even early. We appreciate that. This webinar will be recorded. So if you'd like to remain anonymous, don't turn on your camera or your microphone. You'll have a chance to speak in the Q&A section at the end. And we appreciate that this is quite an important space for honest and open dialogue. So we encourage you to speak, and we're going to take your questions at the end, some written questions and some video questions. In case you didn't know, this is a student-led conference. So this is the student team: Augustin, who's currently working on his PhD, Christina, working on her master's, myself, I just finished my undergrad, and our fearless leader, Ronke, working on her master's, and Sheila, working on her PhD. Now, we acknowledge that this discussion doesn't take place in a vacuum. We acknowledge the recent unfolding of events, and we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement at this time, and we mourn all people that have been harmed or have lost their lives to racist police brutality worldwide, and we refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice, and pledge to listen and to expand our knowledge and to even stimulate discussion, because we believe that it's through open and honest discussion that we can inform positive and meaningful change. Awesome. We're going to have some resources that will be made available to you, ally resources, mental health resources, and decolonization resources. I think we're going to send you an email with these things on, but follow our social media accounts to know exactly what we're going to do and ship out to you. Okay, so stop. Now to introduce our speaker of the hour, Daniel Stone. Daniel is a graduate from Oxford. He has a degree in economics and management. Daniel became the co-founder of the Oxford Black Alumni Network. He is committed to using his time, skills, and energy to contribute to institutions and initiatives that foster effective, positive social change. And recently he's released his first book called After Oxford, and we'll hear more about his book at the end. But for now, he will speak to us about student activism and breaking down barriers to decolonizing the curriculum. Daniel.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all as well for your patience with some of these technical difficulties as we come to operate in a slightly unusual world. And it's a real kind of privilege to have the chance to speak to you all this afternoon. As mentioned by Jonathan, we don't exist in a vacuum, and it definitely feels like a kind of timely and in some senses historical moment when it comes to actually how this country in particular is beginning to kind of ask questions and explore issues to do with race and racial equality. And of course, we kind of see what happens in George Floyd, but we know that actually there have been decades really of kind of similar cases of police brutality, most of them of which were met largely by silence in this country. And then alongside that, of course, we kind of have had the kind of ongoing coronavirus crisis. And again, that exposed a number of inequalities, again linked to race and people from certain backgrounds, that again largely wasn't met with silence as well. And so it does feel like a timely moment where suddenly that silence has been broken, and actually there's a lot of interest in interesting conversations and statements written by a whole range of different organizations in response to that. And so I think it's a timely opportunity for us to now reflect on actually how we begin to respond to that as students, and how we begin to kind of break down some of the institutional barriers that do exist. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. And so my intention is to speak for kind of no longer than half an hour, I'll say, because I do want to leave enough time at the end to kind of have a discussion and questions, because I understand that actually there'll be a lot of people in this discussion who have kind of come and selected this particular talk for a number of different reasons, and there might be things that you want to discuss or hear my views on. So I'll kind of just give you some background to kind of my own experiences of trying to break down institutional barriers, sometimes within quite traditional structures, and hopefully there'll be some lessons that we can learn for this particular case that we're in. Oh, how do I move this presentation?
Yeah, that was my difficulty.
Oh, there you go.
You have to click the slide.
Okay, brilliant. Yes, so as mentioned, we are in a kind of particular moment in time, and this was a photo that was taken from the protest in Birmingham that I attended. And I think for me, one of the things that really kind of stood out from this moment was actually the youthfulness of the crowd and the diversity of the crowd. And so for me, I kind of left this event kind of really with a feeling of hope. When I think we think about students and kind of students of all ages who in many ways have that passion and desire to kind of see change. But the unfortunate thing is that many of the people who we see in similar crowds like this are not the people who we see occupying positions of power within our institutions. And so often that kind of gap between these people who are kind of have the lived experience of what it is like to live in a kind of unjust system are separate to those people who do occupy those positions of power. And so it is essential that we start to think about how we go about really trying to use the strengths that we do have on this particular level. So I thought I'd start just by kind of giving you a bit of a background to who I am. So this is a picture of me, probably when I was about 11 or 12, with my granddad, who is my dad's dad. So my grandparents moved from Jamaica to Handsworth in Birmingham in the 1960s. And both kind of sets of my grandparents on both sides kind of worked mainly in kind of manual occupations. So either working in factories or doing, in this case, painting and plastering. And so my kind of grandparents, their experience of kind of life in kind of Birmingham was one primarily based on survival and hope. And I think to a certain extent, I often reflect on what it must have taken for you to uproot your whole family and choose to relocate in a very different, much colder country. And I think much of that was kind of founded on that psyche of the UK and England being a better society, being a more moral society, being a society whose streets were paved with gold. And so the idea of actually decolonizing kind of particular ways of thought, actually, to be honest, is still alive sometimes within people themselves who are from minority backgrounds. And so there is that challenge, and I saw that challenge very much reflected within my own parents. I think there was one particular instance where kind of growing up, I remember us having a kind of picture in our living room of Jesus with like blue eyes and kind of blonde hair, and that kind of like image of actually that being the idol being or creature being somebody who had blue eyes and blonde hair. And I remember my dad kind of going to a kind of conference, maybe probably when I was at a similar age to when this photograph was taken. And I remember him coming home and taking down that picture, and kind of from that kind of being a sense of actually him beginning to really develop a real sense of pride in his culture and background and history, and not needing to aspire to be something or someone that he wasn't. So I think there can be all sorts of different ways where our culture, our religious beliefs, all sorts of different things can affect the way that we see ourselves and the way that we interact with the world around us. And so for me, that really begins to kind of answer the first question, really, when it comes to breaking down the barriers. And to me, it's important that actually, first and foremost, we begin to break down the barriers within ourselves. Because as mentioned, there are these so subtle things, because I remember kind of growing up, and you'd always kind of have those films where the first character who was killed off was the one black character, and the person who ended up saving the day and being the hero ended up being the kind of white character. So very much that kind of mentality in terms of what society and those sort of things teaches you, I think, is really important within your own mindset and developing your sense of self. So I won't dwell on this point for too long, but for me, this is a necessary first step, is that kind of consciousness and responsibility that we all have as individuals, to really begin to learn and understand some of those subtleties within society. So for me, if you're somebody who's a minority, it comes back to kind of loving yourself, knowing your history, challenging even mindsets to do colorism or apathy. And even those mindsets that can force you to accept the world as it is rather than actually pushing for change. And so for me, the kind of first step is breaking the barrier within yourself. And equally for people who would see themselves as being within the majority culture, there is that step then of kind of coming to terms with your privilege and understanding those systems and attitudes that exist and that do oppress the other within society. So I think it's only when we both come to terms with kind of these problematic mindsets on both sides of things that I think we can then begin to move forward together. So after growing up, I then went to the University of Oxford, where I studied economics and management. And again, I mean, on the surface, you would think that a subject like economics might not be top of your list when it came to actually decolonizing curricula, because in many ways, it's quite a kind of formal math-based subject. So, like, you know, your economic models work whether you're in the UK or whether you're in another part of the world. But actually, when you kind of go deeper to some of the fundamental underlying assumptions that guide some of those mathematical models, you see that actually they are assumptions based on selfishness, based on individualism, based on expansion, based on maximizing everything that one has. And all these things in many ways are quite westernized colonial mindsets. So I think there is a question that all of us have to ask, whether we're students or kind of working in the faculty, is to actually begin to kind of ask ourselves, you know, where are there opportunities within our own disciplines, whatever those disciplines might be, to actually begin to identify those areas where the curriculum could be broadened and where actually we can have a slightly richer experience of our particular subject. So after doing my undergraduate at Oxford, I then kind of went on to UCL, where I did a master's in educational planning and economics. And I really found kind of doing a master's that we were given a much kind of freer rein in terms of actually things that we wanted to kind of go off and research and study. So given that my subject kind of had a real focus on education, I was really kind of seeking to kind of go beyond the curriculum, and look for opportunities where I could kind of try to integrate new ways of kind of thinking and being. And so in doing some of this kind of reading and research and study, I came across the term Ubuntu, which means, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this, which means I am because you are. And for me, I remember just reflecting on that statement, I am because you are, and actually that really being an important and fundamental statement for actually how that might then impact your education system, your economic system, your social system. And very much a lot of the reading that I did then on the back of that was thinking about how that mindset was then beginning to kind of change systems of education within some of the countries that I was studying. And so in terms of kind of defining what decolonizing the curriculum means for me, I think it's very much around acknowledging that knowledge and wisdom exists beyond our narrow view and our narrow Western experience. And that in itself can be an eye-opening experience for certain institutions. But in fact, I think there is a real a sense that actually there is important wisdom and knowledge that exists beyond things that we would understand. And even when we think about things like mindfulness, that recently has had a lot of attention within the UK and Western societies, but that within other cultures has existed for centuries and centuries, and people have practiced for centuries and centuries. And so I think for me, there is probably a real pride and arrogance sometimes when it comes to actually how Western societies have viewed their knowledge compared to other cultures, that I think is unfair and unwise, and that actually in many ways means that these institutions are failing in their basic duty of actually providing a holistic education. And so in terms of kind of how we then go about thinking around how we might break down some of those institutional barriers, I thought it would be helpful for me just to kind of reflect on a few practical examples from my time in Oxford and from student campaigns and student activities that I ran while in Oxford, and how we then went about trying to both understand some of those challenges and then trying to address them and lead to meaningful change. So the first example I'll use is that of the living wage campaign. And again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the living wage. It's the idea that you have the national minimum wage, but actually that minimum wage isn't enough for people to really live on when you take into account transportation costs, living costs, just the basic costs of kind of living, especially within a relatively expensive city like London. So while I was in Oxford, I had an additional year where I was a sabbatical officer for the Oxford Student Union, or the equivalent of the Student Guild. And my focus was on issues to do with community and charitable issues within the university. So we'd identified the living wage as something that we wanted to campaign for within the University of Oxford. And so for me, I think there were kind of four important steps. So the first step really was kind of understanding whether the university would actually get or understand why the living wage was an important issue. And the answer was no. I think for many of the people within the kind of more senior people within the university, the idea of actually the living wage and minimum wages was beyond their lived experience. There weren't people who interacted with people who might have been on the minimum wage or living wage. And so it was something that they didn't initially get as to why this was an important issue. So the second step was that we then had to begin to educate them on why it was important. And so for me, this meant a series of very early mornings, standing outside university buildings to then have the chance to speak to cleaners. So I think we'd identified that actually cleaners were most likely to be the group who were not being paid the living wage. And so we kind of went out and tried to kind of get some stories or interviews with them. And the stories were heartbreaking. These were people who, in many occasions, were working several jobs and were still unable to make ends meet. So armed with these stories, as well as with kind of economic evidence to prove the benefit of paying a living wage, we then kind of went to the university and organised a meeting to then speak to one of the pro-vice chancellors about our particular asks. And then the third thing I think that we really had to kind of bring in terms of actually why this was important was the university's reputation, both kind of the responsibilities that we felt Oxford should have as kind of one of the most well-known institutions in the world, but also the fact that actually if they, well, we did also threaten that if they didn't act that we would potentially leak some of these stories to the national press. So you do probably have to know what levers to push or pull to kind of make your voice heard. But I think it was that sense of actually us standing alongside the university and really helping to educate them on why this was an important issue. So firstly, we felt they didn't get it. The second thing was that we then took the time to educate them. But then the third thing was that we went into this meeting with a specific ask. So we went in kind of knowing that we wanted a certain amount per hour for cleaners to be paid. And importantly, we went in kind of knowing that it wasn't just enough for the university to pay it, but also we needed their suppliers to pay the living wage. Because often they would say, you know, it's not down to us, it's a system that goes through procurement and it's outsourced and so on and so on. But we said no, like this is both for you, for anyone who you directly employ, but also for your suppliers as well. And then the fourth thing was that we followed up, and I think this can be really important when it comes to student activism, is that often kind of whether you're in a sabbatical role or whether you're kind of chairing a student committee, you're only in post for 1 year, and then you potentially move on and someone else takes your place. So I think having a plan for longevity and who will kind of continue your work beyond your time in office or beyond the year that you have, I think is really critical as well. So although I reached a certain stage of negotiations, I think when I left my sabbatical post, it still hadn't been agreed, but we had another chair who was then able to continue those discussions with the university. And then several months later, I got a text to say that the university had agreed to pay their staff a living wage. So that's the first example. The second example I will use is of the 100 Voices campaign, which was a campaign that I ran during my third year of studying at Oxford. So again, to kind of go through those steps, the first step again was whether the university got it. And no, the university did not get it. So in terms of what the campaign was trying to do, it was organized by the Campaign for Racial Awareness and Equality to really highlight cases to do with racism or discrimination within the University of Oxford. So I remember, I think, the initial meeting that we had with the Pro-Vice Chancellor, who told me and I think the other co-chair that there was no racism in Oxford. So in answer to whether they got it, they definitely did not get why this was an important issue. So then the second point was that we then had to educate them. So the 100 Voices campaign was trying to record the experiences of 100 Black and Asian minority ethnic students, and a whole range of experiences, both kind of positive experiences as well as kind of those experiences that would be negative and microaggressions and things of that nature. So once we recorded it, we wrote this up into a report. Again, I think in this case, we didn't really want to use the kind of reputational stick. I think we were always wary that a kind of news story to do with Oxford being racist was likely to have a negative impact on prospective students. So I think we were always careful about trying to keep a lid on this rather than pushing it out to the press or media. But in many ways, I think the university did respond positively to that report. But then our third step in terms of actually our specific ask, in many ways, it wasn't specific enough. So the first thing was that I think we entered into this kind of particular negotiation blind. I think it wasn't quite, we weren't sure really who held the power when it came to actually changing things of this nature, when it came to actually, because in many ways, these were complex issues to do with changing culture and changing the kind of cultural makeup of particular colleges or things that didn't really have an easy solution and that would require us to work across 38 individual colleges rather than just a central university. So in many ways, I think our asks weren't quite specific enough to lead to the change that we wanted to see. But then the good news was that we did have follow-up. So we had students who again came after us and who were able to do a part 2 of the report and continue to kind of push for for changes in policies and all sorts of different things that led to meaningful change in the university. So what does this mean then? Kind of referring to this particular campaign then that we're looking at in terms of decolonizing the curriculum. So the first question again is, do they get it? And my initial response would probably be that I suspect that they do not. And the reason why I say that is because I think many of the people who we see as being in positions of power and leadership are likely to have benefited from a system that in many ways is unjust and that kind of protects their particular way of thinking and being. And to be fair, they may also be slightly ignorant to some of these issues. You know, you might hear kind of phrases like knowledge is knowledge and all sorts of different things that seek to brush some of the other perspectives under the carpet rather than addressing things from a slightly different perspective. And so I think there does need to be a process of education, and that actually those of us who are in the know need to be proactive, I think, in trying to push this agenda forward. So my belief is that they do not get it. So then the second point then is kind of what are our specific asks when it comes to then addressing this issue and seeking progress on this particular issue. Because for me, kind of decolonizing the curriculum as an aim in and of itself is not very smart. By smart, I mean kind of specific, measurable, and so on, rather than the other interpretation. So what are the kind of specific asks? So are there specific modules in particular subjects? So for example, history and politics, for example, might be the kind of subjects where you think there'd be an essential case really to try to make sure that we have reading lists that are more kind of reflective of society. And then if so, what then are our specific asks in terms of those reading lists? So is it to have a 50% of kind of reading lists that are non-white male? Well, I think you just kind of off the top of my head. So what are the specific asks that we have? And who are some of the specific authors and people who we think would help to enrich our curriculum? And then the other kind of thought I have in terms of specific ask is that sometimes we can have a mindset that if something isn't perfect, then it's not good enough. And I think sometimes with bigger campaigns, I think you do kind of have to target those small wins. So what actually is achievable within the next academic year, within the next few months? You know, if we get over that hurdle, what might we then push for in 5 years' time and so on? So I think kind of having those specific asks that are realistic, that can give you a small win to then build momentum, I think is quite important when you're trying to win people over to a cause that on the surface seems to be quite complex. And then the third point is then to whom. So again, it's about understanding the sources of power within whatever context you're in. So who are the kind of pro-vice chancellors or the deputy pro-vice chancellors who have responsibility within this particular area, and which kind of areas does this cross over? So now within the University of Birmingham, each kind of college and school will have directors of education. They may have equalities leads. There's deputy both pro-vice chancellors and pro-vice chancellors who have responsibility for issues to do with education and equality. So it's thinking about who those specific people are in terms of actually their interests and how you might align yourself with them. And then also thinking about the other allies that you might have within the wider institution. Because I think there is that kind of tendency or fallacy to believe that if an institution as a whole has a particular culture or mindset, that actually that's reflected in all of its individuals, when the reality is that you are likely to find pockets of individuals or schools or people who do want to see change. So it's about trying to provide a banner for those people to unite under. And then the fourth point then is whether you speak their language. And so for me, I think this is then reflecting on what levers you can pull and actually what's important to those individuals. So as mentioned, for the living wage, a lot of the levers we pulled were in relation to reputation, and some of the economic arguments. And for the University of Birmingham, I think there'd be levers related to the BAME attainment gap, to student surveys, to the Race Equality Charter. So again, what are the kind of things that these individuals would care about, and how can you align your campaign with some of the things that matter to them? And then the fifth thing then is do you have any examples? And I think this is something that bigger institutions really, in many ways, they'll base a lot of their decision making based on the other examples or other activities that have taken place in similar institutions. So are there other Russell Group universities or other large institutions or other universities in other parts of the world that are maybe a step or two ahead of where we are, and how has the impact been of their decisions to then kind of try to decolonize their curriculum. So I think often using other examples can both help to translate some of your kind of claims into language that universities are used to, but it can also then put pressure on them to not be left behind when other universities are starting to think about these things differently. So then just to kind of wrap up, because I think student voice is critical, and I think often students have a lot more power than what they know, both as kind of being the people who are kind of customers and who are demanding universities to provide a particular service, but also because students in many ways give a really important voice and platform to people who otherwise would remain silent. So students in my example were able to kind of give a voice to cleaners, to people who often the university had marginalized or ignored. And so I think there's an opportunity for students to really be able to give voice to silent allies, to be able to give voice to minority groups, to really structure themselves in a way that is democratic and fair. And so I'd close just by saying that, as mentioned, we're living in historical times where people are listening, and I believe are kind of slowly awakening to kind of issues to do with kind of racial inequality. So my question is, what do you want to say in this moment? Because it is a really important moment. I mean, I think we've seen recently, even in the past week or so, where you've had kind of a kind of number of statues of colonialists that have been pulled down all across the country and the world as well, where these have been issues that have been campaigned about, as mentioned, for decades, if not longer, without action. So this does seem like an opportune moment. So I think I would leave that as my closing reflection, really, that people are listening. So what do you want to say? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that talk. Very informative, very concise. And for me, it's actually quite inspiring to hear not just, oh, I see people clapping for you. It's inspiring to hear not just like the theory that you want to expand on, but actually the practice, the things that you've done. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Now we can have some Q&A and pick your brain a bit. So I'll give you a few minutes just to think what questions you might have. You can drop them in the chat, then I can pitch them to Daniel. Then after we have a few of those questions, I'll give an opportunity for those who are brave enough to come on video and ask a question to do so. So just a few minutes to just reflect. Was that clear? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, John.
Awesome, thanks for the feedback. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of hellos and a lot of thank yous. I think to you, Daniel. Wow. You got people here from Portsmouth, Sheffield, Northampton, Bristol, that's where I'm from. Roehampton, Glasgow, Sweden, wow, we're international. Okay, so I've got one question here to get the ball rolling from Olivia. She says, I'd really like to hear more about the Oxford Black Alumni Network and how this has already helped people to get opportunities after uni.
Yes, so I think the network was started, I think around 3 years ago now. So it actually began from I think it was a campaign that was started within a group of black male students who were studying at the University of Cambridge. And they decided to take a picture together to kind of just show that actually there were different forms of students who were kind of going to Cambridge, and to really kind of start a debate again around access to education. So I think we then felt as alumni that we then wanted to do a picture to say, you know, because there is that sense of actually access and getting into university is great, but it's kind of one step, and then there's a whole set of new challenges that you sometimes face post-graduation as well. So I think we wanted to kind of take a photo to kind of stand in solidarity with students and to say actually there is a kind of community that then exists beyond your time at university and that can continue to support. So I think after that initial photo, we then decided actually rather than just kind of gathering in an ad hoc fashion, it'd be good to kind of put a bit of a structure around it. And so we kind of started the network with the purpose of primarily kind of giving people a network beyond their time at university, but then to think about how that network could then support the next generation of young people who are thinking about universities and thinking about whether they're and thinking about their own kind of space within society as well. So in terms of some of the things we've done, we've had a number of kind of member events, but we've also kind of done speaker events in schools around the UK. We've kind of contributed to access conferences. We've done mentoring and guidance for students who are going through the Oxford application process. And I think we've also just continued to try to do what we can in terms of policy and seeking to engage universities in terms of some of their thinking and processes too.
Awesome. Next question comes from Azza. They say, thank you, appreciate your insights. What are your thoughts on the marketization of universities, such as the privatization of STEM subjects, corporate funding, and university league tables? Does this present a problem for decolonizing the curriculum?
Oh, that's a good question. So as an economist, I think I am slightly wary that models that were designed for a particular setting and purpose have been adapted to all sorts of different environments where they were initially constructed for that purpose. And in doing that, I think there are risks that often people don't take the time to actually think, you know, is it right for us to kind of think about the value that we're extracting from this particular activity in a quantitative economic fashion, or is it best represented by other forms of thinking? So often people like to just throw quantitative numbers and tables and league tables at things because it kind of gives you a clear visual representation. But that number might not actually be a fair representation of actually the true value that's held in that particular activity. So I think it is problematic. But I think that is also just the reality of the world that we live in, where people like those things and kind of want those things in order to prove growth and that things are working well. So in terms of what that means, so it's not ideal, but for me, it presents an opportunity when it comes to actually driving forward your particular campaign or agenda, because there'll be things, as mentioned, that the universities care about because it will affect their league tables and because it will affect them in different ways. So that gives campaigners an opportunity to actually say, how can we understand the composition of those metrics, and how can our aim or the thing that we're working towards also kind of tick the boxes for the wider institution as well. So I think it's not ideal, but I think if we're smart, we can align the kind of outcomes and aims of our campaigns with things that the university cares about, and it kind of gives us then a seat around the table to have these necessary conversations about change.
Yeah, I feel like stats are the sort of a tricky thing, because if you're in control of the variables that you want to address, then you can sort of control the values that come out, and it can sort of show what you wanted to show.
Yeah.
I know that Oxford and Cambridge have been talking recently about how much they've increased the diverse student body, there's been some like backlash as to like what does it actually show qualitatively. I'm not sure if you heard about that.
Yeah, and to be fair, they were also starting from quite a low bar, so
Yeah.
increasing it wasn't necessarily the most difficult task. But I think you're right. I think it does. Yeah, so that's kind of help in terms of accountability, um, and yeah, and showing a degree of progress. But I think you're right. Those kind of more qualitative, actually, what are the experience? What have the experience of those students been? I think actually institutions need to take the time to think about data in a more holistic sense.
Okay, I've got a more abstract question now from Margaret asking about language. Language has always been used, the language that's been used has always been the language of the colonizers. It's been used as a powerful tool to deter change. How do we know what language should be used? Margaret from Trinidad.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. Again, it kind of partly does refer to some of that question of actually the language of data and metrics in many ways, kind of being that kind of like that kind of Western drive for kind of constant improvement and yeah, to kind of being able to actually prove logically or rationally certain things. I think kind of lends itself to a certain way of thinking and speaking and quantifying things. Which I think that's true in that it's not ideally where you want to get to when you're measuring the value or determining whether to do a certain thing or not. But I think we have to acknowledge that in order to kind of change the system, I think there's different approaches to it. You kind of have some approach that's like, okay, let's just try and break the entire system and from the outside without engaging with it. And I think for institutions of this size, with this level of integration within our culture and way of being and our economy and our education system, it's very difficult to kind of change institutions like this from the outside. I think you might be able to kind of put pressure on certain levers, but I don't think you'll ever be able to get the real revolutionary change just by pushing from the outside. So I think for me, you then have to engage with their particular kind of ways of speaking and being in their language. So I think any movement I think has people who are comfortable working in different environments, whether those are your agitators who are pushing and doing what they can from their outside, whether those are the people who are seeking to have meetings in the boardrooms to then sit down with the heads of the institutions. You've got to have different sorts of people within a movement. But I'd say that sense of kind of understanding their language and being able to speak their language, I think is important for being able to kind of push for change from the inside.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Next question comes from Eleanor, who is asking, so there's one barrier to uni students. I guess they're saying one barrier to change is that students aren't necessarily active enough as campaigners. And I mean, we know from history that students have been at the forefront of some of the largest social changes, and they're asking that, do you have any advice on how to spark interest or activism in students, how to sort of move from theory, which is quite easy, to actually like doing things action?
Oh, that's really. Actually, are we allowed to hear from people? Because I'd be really interested to kind of hear her. Because
You want some?
yeah, because so I'm kind of conscious that I was a student like over 10 years ago. So in terms of kind of my experience of actually what the student body was, I think it again, like things continue to like evolve. So I think when I was at university, again, you'd kind of have a certain group of people who were apathetic or who just didn't really want to get engaged or involved. But then you did kind of have certain kind of flashpoints that suddenly would kind of spark people sometimes into life or to kind of being aware of some of these issues. And definitely when I think about what's happened recently with George Floyd, to me, that is a kind of an opportunity to really kind of mobilize people from all sorts of backgrounds around some of the issues and to educate and to inspire people to get involved. So I think for me, it's probably just about kind of knowing, the context in which you're in. and then thinking about how you then appeal to kind of different groups. So I think there are some people who naturally are socially minded and would kind of get behind these causes without much persuasion. And then there's other people, then to kind of go back to the other question, you do kind of have to translate things into their language for them then to understand why it's important. So I think it's probably kind of thinking about how you engage with both groups.
Okay, I'm gonna try to direct. Sophia has a question. How do you reconcile or work with co-opting of the work? At Kiel, those at the grassroots have felt very frustrated when their uni speaks of decolonizing without referencing the work done by people on the ground. Any thoughts on that? Sounds very specific.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think my honest view is that often kind of being at the grassroots is kind of one of the most, I think it's one of those areas where, as you mentioned, you do a lot of the work without necessarily getting much of the profile or acknowledgement of the work you've done. So I think for me, the biggest reward you can get is the fact that actually the things that you wanted to happen have happened. Because actually when the size of institutions, they're unlikely often to kind of give credit or reference to those groups who have kind of agitated and forced them into something. But actually, I think the greatest reward has to be the fact that the thing that you pushed for has now happened, and that progress is happening in the areas that you care about. So I'd say it's probably, yeah. So I know, I can imagine that it would be frustrating, and that actually would be, and you'd hope that the better institutions would actually, as part of their acceptance of why this is important, would also acknowledge the fact that actually the knowledge to generate this change came from a kind of grassroots perspective as well. But that's far from guaranteed. So I'd say you probably have to take your greatest reward from the fact that you've seen change, and if you do get acknowledgement, then just to see that as a bonus.
Okay, we've got 8 minutes left in this webinar, so to think about how to be tactical with the time. So in our previous 2 webinars, we actually went over by about 10 minutes. I'm not sure how busy your schedule is, but we might have to, if you'll allow, go over a bit more to get these questions in. So Emily, I think that's how you pronounce it, has asked the question, how have you explained decolonization to people who don't get it in terms of decolonizing the culture?
Oh.
Kind of links to the question from before.
Yeah. So I think, yeah. So I think that those examples, I think, are always important. So depending on who the individual is, who you're speaking to, so whether they're coming from a particular discipline or background, I think your response will vary depending on who the person is you're talking to. I think for me, how I always explain it is, it's kind of just related to that sense of kind of Western knowledge and ways of thinking and ways of being, just being like quite a narrow view. Like when you kind of take that into account, given actually the breadth of experiences and cultures in the world, actually if you kind of base your whole teaching and learning over something that's just from a kind of narrow select group of people in a select group of countries, then you're missing out on all of this really. So it kind of varies depending on who the individual is, but I think I just tend to explain it within the context of narrowness, the fact that actually there's a whole breadth of knowledge and understanding and ways of being that we're only really starting to really engage with as the West. And I think things like meditation and mindfulness, I think is an example that I think a lot of people can engage with. So the fact that actually there is just so much more that we could get if we chose to kind of go from our narrow view to having a view that was slightly wider.
Awesome. I think I'll take just one more written question for now before we shift gears. This question comes from Tamara, who says, thank you, Daniel. This was a great practical perspective. My question is, how might we get Black students to break barriers within themselves, something that you touched upon, or do that introspective reflection for those who are in the majority at their institution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when it comes to Black students, I think, yeah, as I mentioned like during that point, I think we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to kind of like learn and look at things from like a different perspective. And I think, as mentioned, this whole push now when it in terms of kind of things in the aftermath of George Floyd, there's been a whole list of different resources that have come out to kind of help to educate people when it comes to issues to do with race, both in terms of from like a white supremacist perspective, but also I think for us as kind of Black people as well, to be able to be more confident in kind of sharing our stories and kind of understanding some of the influences that kind of living in the society may have even had on our own mindset and way of being. So I think in terms of kind of practical things, I think kind of reading I think is an important step in terms of actually just exposing yourself to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And actually, to be fair, you don't even need to read today. You can just like go on YouTube or have a look at look at things on TV. So I think anything that engages you with the perspective that will help you to uncover some of that blindness when it comes to actually seeing some of these issues, I think is really important. And I think, and in terms of that specific question around Black students, I think we kind of have a responsibility, if you're like a member of like a minority or a Black community, to try to allow those messages to be kind of translated to people in your group. So whether that's through places where you gather, through families, through whatever means it is, trying to pass down some of those messages in the most efficient way. And then in terms of engaging with the minority, with the majority, again, I think there's so much more that institutions could do. When you think about things to do with like unconscious bias training, or training to do with all sorts of prejudices and discrimination, which often is just seen as a bit of an add-on in most institutions, whereas to me it should be a really important part both of kind of inducting people, but also when you think about kind of our national curriculum and actually ensuring that actually it forms an important part of an education system too.
Awesome. I think I forgot to say, if you want to do a live question like with your video and stuff, then just there's a function where you can wave your hand. So if you press the wave hand function, then I can see that you want to speak. Oh, I see the first one. Then I'll just unmute you and put your camera on.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I just want to say, as an incoming Black SAB, what advice would you give to tackle these challenges and like the student activism around decolonizing the curriculum?
Cool. Hi Louise, good to meet you, and well done on winning your election.
Thank you very much.
So I'd say so I think kind of being organized, I think is really important. So kind of thinking about whether there are particular student groups or kind of student allies who can kind of give you a key foundation, and then thinking about how you might then build on that. I think kind of the academic community, I think is essential when it comes to these sorts of issues. I remember, I think some of the past conferences we've had, I think in person as opposed to being on Zoom, we've had kind of academic members of staff who have been there and who have kind of expressed an interest. So I'd say kind of trying to kind of build and organize a core group of people from like different walks of life within universities, both students, academics, and then beginning them to kind of meet together to build a relationship, but then also to kind of focus in on what you think those key asks or aims need to be, because I think you'll kind of know within your context what kind of those specific asks need to be and what seems reasonable given like your current level of support And in many ways, I think that's why those small wins can be quite important, because actually, if you kind of get a small win, then that might then give you momentum to then kind of get more people engaged and more people involved. So I think, as most things, like anything kind of needs people for it to become alive. So I'd say begin by gathering people. Once you've gathered those people, have a think about what specific asks or things you want to push for with that group of people you have, and use that to then kind of continue to build momentum.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question. Anybody else want to wave their hand and ask a question? A live question. We had a lot of people do live questions in the first seminar, but no one in the second, and then one in the third. So I guess it's just variable. So we started about 3 minutes late. So I think it's perhaps fair to start to go until about 4:05, if that's okay with you. I know you're a busy guy.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna just go back to the written questions. In attempting to, this is from Jason from Belfast, in attempting to talk about a decolonizing agenda in our universities and get it on the agenda, I'm wondering how we safeguard against the university co-opting decolonizing work, and how do we ensure work remains radical and powered by the grassroots? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it just has to be a incremental process, really. I think you're right. Universities will often co-opt things that they think are valuable for their particular aim. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think you kind of have to have that perspective of, as long as we're achieving the outcomes that we want, then it doesn't really matter who gets the particular kind of headline or mention on the university website. But I think beyond that, in terms of actually how you then keep it radical, then I think you're right. There has to be a kind of continuous kind of push and kind of checkpoint to then say, actually, this was what we wanted to achieve. And in many ways, that's why having specific goals is quite helpful, because you know that once you've achieved that particular thing, you can then look back and think, okay, this is what we've achieved. Now that we're here, has that gone enough? Has it gone kind of enough in terms of actually the change you want to see, or do you want to push again? Do you want to expand? So if you are just focused on one particular subject or module or school, and you've achieved that, do you want to look wider? Do you want to look into other things around campus? Do you want to look at more structural issues in the institution? So I think there's always different ways that you can continue to push. I mean, something like this isn't going to be something that is solved overnight. So I think one of the questions will be, actually, once you've kind of got some of the smaller wins, how do you then begin to change things from like a structural or governance perspective, so that actually this kind of sense of critical reflection and constant continuous reflection is built into the formal university structures of what the university does. And again, there's no reason why grassroots organizations can't then be integrated as part of that process. But I think for me, that's how you know that you've definitely succeeded, when there are processes in place to ensure that your voice continues to be heard and continues to challenge things within the university.
Awesome. I'm seeing a couple of questions just asking about decolonizing science subjects, because I guess it's probably more obvious to think of how you can decolonize art subjects, but not so much science ones. Catherine is asking, you mentioned economics having quite a Western and colonial mindset. How can we go about deconstructing this aspect, like this, in aspects like modeling within the subject?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, both in terms of like, yes, STEM subjects, science subjects like economics. Then I think in many ways, I think the way that you do that is kind of earlier on, in terms of actually some of the underlying assumptions. In that kind of, by the time if you're waiting for the moment where you're putting the data into like the model, then that's probably too late in terms of just thinking about when you need to actually challenge some of the underlying assumptions. So I think for me, it's kind of yeah, it's a sense of challenging it in terms of actually what our reasons are for choosing certain models above others, what our thinking is towards actually why we choose to value certain perspectives or ways of thinking, which I think are in common across any subject. So whether you're looking at a social sciences subject, or whether you're looking at more of a kind of STEM or mathematical driven subject, there are kind of key value judgments that will go into you deciding why a particular topic or issue is important, and those assumptions that then guide the principles that then lead to you choosing to act out that particular model in a particular way. So I think for me, I think it's probably important to then go back. This is getting to be quite a complex answer, but it's important to kind of go back, I think, as far as you can, to actually say what are some of the underlying assumptions that we've, in many ways, you've stopped thinking about because we've just assumed that that's just how science or maths or economics is done. So what are some of those assumptions, and then if we begin to change some of those things, what does that then look like in terms of how we then put that into practice when it comes to using the models?
Awesome. It's 5 past, so I want to actually exploit my position as the host of this meeting to just ask you the final question that I've just had in my mind for a little while. With all of this activism, we have a vision to bring about positive change and reform for the educational experience of students. I see a potential danger of going from the narrative West is best to West is worse, or from West is best to East is best, or South is best, or anywhere but West is best. And I'm wondering, how do we transcend the framework of looking at the origin of ideas, like an origin-based framework? Do we have any criteria to judge the value of knowledge, epistemologies, models, methods, whatever, in terms of maybe their efficacy in the world, how effective or useful these ideas are?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think we should do. And I think, and I suppose it's important to say that definitely kind of the way that I've spoken about it isn't that the West or that Western ways of thinking are useless. That isn't what I'm saying at all. And in many ways, it's what I've been saying around actually that kind of narrowing. That actually, if you kind of have that view of knowledge being kind of this kind of broad, wide concept that incorporates knowledge from across the whole world, then the West forms part of that, and arguably quite an important part of that. But so it's saying that actually the West is part of that knowledge set, and that population is not the whole of it. So I think kind of acknowledging that actually there is a place, of course, for kind of Western knowledge and Western priorities and ways of thinking, but it's only a part of the whole. I think it's important. And then I think beyond that, I think, and in many ways, this kind of comes back to really the kind of fundamental purpose of why educational institutions and higher education institutions exist. It is to do some of that critical thinking around actually how we understand truth, how we know truth, how we understand all different forms of knowledge within the world that we have. And so for me, that is one of the functions of universities, is to answer those questions about actually how we aggregate or decipher and decide what constitutes kind of truth and reality, and then how we begin to understand and grapple with some of those things. That is the function, I think, of universities. And in many ways, they've been failing in their duty because they've narrowed down that sense of what knowledge is to something that is so narrow. Whereas to me, if you are going to be a institution of higher education or higher learning, you have to look at that broader picture. So in answer, the West is part of our understanding of knowledge. Higher educated institutions should have been encouraging us to kind of think about knowledge that kind of spans beyond just our narrow experience.
Awesome. I think that nuance is so important, really clearly put. So that's it for question and answer. At the start, for those of you who weren't here, I mentioned Daniel has recently released his first book called After Oxford, and I've prepared a little synopsis of your book, and you can just add or correct anything that's incorrect. This is your story, the story of a young Black boy born in a working class family in inner city Brum, who finds himself studying at the University of Oxford in a space that is completely unfamiliar and disorienting, but also character building. It shaped and stretched him beyond anything he could imagine. Daniel survived at Oxford and then thrived at Oxford, becoming the president of the Junior Common Room of St. Peter's College and campaigning on issues of access and racial equality. This book, I think, is such a unique and untold perspective. My only question for you really is, where can we buy this book?
Yeah, so unfortunately, well, I was going to say unfortunately, so it is available on Amazon and Kindle. I say unfortunately because I would have liked it to have been available on other platforms, but I kind of found myself a bit between a rock and a hard place in terms of where I could sell it. So it is available on Amazon and Kindle. And yeah, it's called After Oxford. And I think, as Jonathan mentioned, I think I just felt it was important, and for us for anybody really, and especially for people kind of from a minority background, to be able to kind of share their stories, both and every part of their story, both in terms of their successes as well as their challenges and experience of kind of growing up in a culture that is foreign. So I think for me, it's important to kind of share that sense of what it was like to growing up in Birmingham, getting to Oxford, but then also that bit of their life after Oxford in terms of actually how the world responded to a young black man who was an Oxford graduate. so I hope you do find it interesting if you get it.
Awesome. So it's called After Oxford. You can find it on Amazon. We're going to post a link on our Twitter account. And in general, make sure you're following all of our social accounts to keep up to date with our work. We'll post a link of this meeting on our YouTube channel, on our social media pages. So make sure you're following all of those. Daniel, thank you so much for your talk. Thank you for your insight, and thank you for your time. It was great hearing from you. And thank you to everybody that's come on. We appreciate your engagement. That is the end.
No problem. Thank you guys.
Bye. Goodbye, everybody.